My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 37 years old. And at 11:04 on a Tuesday night, while standing in my home office with a mug of cold tea and 3 monitors still glowing with an open fraud investigation, I read a text message that my sister-in-law had sent to our family group chat like she was announcing a weather update. "You're no longer family. Stay away from our son. My brother will handle everything from here." I set the mug down slowly because my hand was starting to shake. And not from hurt. From recognition. That message was the end of a very specific performance I had been politely refusing to notice for years. I didn't reply in the group chat. I didn't call. I didn't scroll back through the last 3 years of screenshots to prove to anyone that I had been the reliable one. I simply typed 3 words into a private message to my brother. "Understood. Good luck." Then I closed the thread, opened a new spreadsheet, and started listing every account, every signature, every trustee designation, and every safety deposit key that still had my name on it. By 7 the next morning, a custodial account was frozen pending revalidation. A guardianship nomination had been formally withdrawn. And the first tiny crack in the story my brother had been telling, his lawyer was about to split wide enough to swallow him. Before I tell you what my sister-in-law tried to do 48 hours later, and why my nephew's court-appointed advocate ended up calling me at 1 in the morning. Tell me what time it is, where you're watching from, and what state or country you're tuning in from. I want to know how far this story reaches before it lands on someone who has been treated like a convenient signature their whole adult life. Here's what my sister-in-law didn't understand when she fired off that message. She thought she was amputating a difficult in-law from a family unit that no longer needed her. What she was actually severing was the one person who knew exactly where every misrepresented dollar was hidden inside the ongoing divorce. Her husband, my brother Marcus, was trying to win by attrition. I wasn't just the annoying aunt who asked too many questions at Thanksgiving. I work as a senior digital forensics investigator for a regional insurance fraud division, which in plain English means I spend my days tracing money that pretends to be somewhere it isn't. I'm very good at finding phantom transfers, shell accounts, backdated documents, and the particular fingerprints people leave when they try to disappear assets mid-divorce. My family knew what I did. They had always made a show of being impressed at gatherings, introducing me to neighbors, like I was a fun little curiosity. What they actually loved was that I would quietly do them favors that should have cost them thousands. Over the years, I had become the one who reviewed their loan documents, cleaned up my mother's tax filings after a bad accountant, and, most importantly, agreed 5 years ago to serve as the named trustee on a small custodial account set up for my nephew. Elie. When he was 3, the account was meant to be a modest education fund seeded by our grandmother before she passed. I had signed on reluctantly because my grandmother asked me to, with her own mouth. 2 weeks before she died. I took that responsibility seriously, in a way my brother never did. At 7:40 the morning after the group chat, I sat at my kitchen counter with my laptop open, an untouched English muffin, and a cold, clear feeling behind my sternum. Then I did exactly what a professional does when one party to a fiduciary arrangement has publicly repudiated contact with the other. I withdrew. Cleanly, and in writing. I sent a formal notice to the custodial account's institutional administrator, stating that effective immediately, I would no longer accept informal instructions relayed through my brother or his wife, and that any movement of funds, any change of beneficiary contact, and any update to the tax reporting address would require direct written authorization through the account's proper channels. With my signature notarized, I withdrew myself as a standby guardian nominee that Marcus had casually listed on some old estate paperwork from when Eli was a newborn. Paperwork I had told him more than once needed to be updated, which he had never done. I flagged the joint password Marcus had once given me for a shared family cloud folder, informing him in a brief email that I had removed myself from the share and deleted my local access. I sent a single polite note to my mother, stating that any financial favor previously routed through me would need a different contact going forward. No speeches. No accusation. Just lawful exits from rooms I had never been thanked for standing in. And then the consequences started rolling in. Faster than I expected. Because it turned out, my brother had been relying on my presence in those rooms to prop up a version of his life he could no longer afford. By 9:30, the custodial account administrator called Marcus directly for verification on a scheduled withdrawal he had requested 2 weeks earlier. He couldn't produce me because I wouldn't sign. By 10:15, his divorce attorney's paralegal left me a voicemail asking whether I could confirm a statement Marcus had included in his financial disclosure. I didn't return the call. By 11, my mother texted, "Honey, what on earth is going on? Marcus is beside himself. Funny how fast you're no longer family turns into. Can you please pick up when the paperwork stops moving on its own?" Have you ever noticed that the people who love their clean cut-off speeches the most are always the ones who forget to check what's still tangled on the other side? By 1 in the afternoon, I had 11 missed calls. My brother, my sister-in-law Chelsea, my mother, my father, and 2 numbers I didn't recognize. I let them stack. I was at work by then, buried in a genuine case involving a man in Ohio who thought a backdated UPS tracking number would cover up a 6-figure staged theft. Real fraude. Real deadlines. Real consequences. My family's sudden interest in me could wait. At 4:30, my sister-in-law sent her second message of the week. And this one wasn't for a group chat. It was a long paragraph directly to me. Opening with Claire. "I think there has been a misunderstanding." I read it twice because the first time I almost laughed. A misunderstanding. 22 hours after telling me I wasn't family and to stay away from her child. She was asking me whether we could please speak because some paperwork had not been handled correctly, and the education account seemed to be locked. And Marcus was under so much pressure right now with the divorce, and wasn't it better if we behaved like adults about all of this? I didn't answer. I kept working. What tipped this from a messy family text thread into something I actually needed to document was an email that arrived at 5:11 that evening from an address I didn't recognize. The sender introduced herself as Rebecca Whitmore, which was technically my sister-in-law's legal name, even though she had been going by Chelsea since college. Except this, Rebecca was not Chelsea. This Rebecca was Marcus's first wife. The one he had been married to for 18 months in his early 20s. The one we had all quietly agreed never to mention, because Marcus found the subject embarrassing. Her email was short, careful, and brutally clear. She wrote that she had been trying to track me down for months, because she had come into possession of certain documents during her own long-delayed divorce finalization. Documents that appeared to show Marcus had never actually filed the dissolution paperwork with the court the way he had told her. And the way he had told our family. 17 years earlier. She wanted to know if I, as a forensic specialist, I could help her understand what she was looking at. Because her attorney had quietly suggested it was possible, though not certain, that Marcus had been legally married to both her and Chelsea at the same time for almost a decade and a half. I read that email 3 times, with the kind of stillness I usually only feel on cases. Then I stood up, walked to my kitchen, drank a full glass of water, and thought about my nephew. 2 days after Chelsea's original group chat message, I had 47 missed calls and a voicemail from a name I had not expected to hear. Not my brother. Not my mother. a woman named Andrea Park, who identified herself as the court-appointed advocate assigned to review my nephew's best interests in the ongoing Whitmore divorce. She said she had obtained my contact information through the custodial account administrator, that she had limited time before a procedural hearing, and that she would very much like to speak with me because a question had arisen about the trustee structure of Eli's education fund and whether certain representations made by his father in sworn financial disclosures were consistent with the actual account activity. She closed with one sentence that told me everything. I understand from one of the parties that you are no longer considered family, but you are still the trustee of record. And that distinction matters to this court. I saved the voicemail. Then I called her back. Not out of revenge, but because a 7-year-old boy was somewhere in the middle of this. And he had a grandmother who had once asked me, with her oxygen tank hissing beside her hospital bed, to make sure his future was protected if no one else was paying attention. I spoke with Andrea Park for 52 minutes. I answered every question she asked, accurately, calmly, and without offering opinions on anything that wasn't already in a document. She asked whether I had authorized a withdrawal of $11,000 from the custodial account 14 months ago, tied to what had been described in the divorce disclosure as a tutoring and enrichment expense. I said no. I had not authorized that withdrawal. She asked whether I had been aware of a secondary beneficiary designation that had been added last spring. I said no. I had not been aware. She asked whether the statements I received as trustee matched the statements Marcus had entered into evidence. I said I would need to compare them side by side. She sent me a copy of what had been filed with the court. And when I laid it next to my own records, the numbers didn't just disagree. They disagreed in a pattern. Someone had been moving money in small, unremarkable amounts, routing it through an intermediary account, and misrepresenting the balance by just enough each quarter that a casual observer would never notice. But I'm not a casual observer. I found 3 years of consistent, deliberate discrepancies within 40 minutes. My chest didn't hurt. My training kicked in. I built a clean timeline, a clean exhibit, and a clean written summary that described what the documents showed without describing what I thought of the person behind them. Then I signed an affidavit authenticating my own trustee records and sent the whole packet to Andrea Park through a formal legal channel. That was the night Marcus finally stopped pretending to be offended and showed me who he really was. He called from a number I didn't have saved. When I answered, he didn't say hello. He said, "What did you just do to my life?" I told him I had answered questions from a court advocate. He said, "You could have warned me." I said, "You told your wife to tell me I'm not family. Family gets warnings. Strangers get subpoenas." He went quiet. Then, with a kind of low, careful anger, I hadn't heard from him since we were teenagers. He said the sentence that confirmed what I had already suspected. "You always thought you were better than us, because you have that little badge and that little salary. And now you're going to watch what happens when I lose everything. Not I didn't do this. Not there's been a misunderstanding. Just a threat dressed up as a lament." I didn't raise my voice. I said, "Marcus, I hope, for Eli's sake, that you find a way to be truthful in court. Because the documents are going to speak either way." Then I hung up. That's when my mother started. The voicemails. The texts. The long paragraphs about how family sticks together. How Marcus was under enormous strain. How Chelsea hadn't meant that group chat message the way it sounded. How I was being cold. How grandmother would be so disappointed. That last one stopped me for a moment. Because my mother had always been willing to weaponize my grandmother's memory whenever simpler tactics failed. I wrote her back exactly one line. Grandmother asked me to protect Eli. That is what I am doing. The next morning, I learned what had really been going on. Because Rebecca, the first wife, sent me a second email with attachments. Marcus had never legally dissolved their marriage. He had filed the initial paperwork and paid the fees. And then, for reasons that were either laziness, cowardice, or calculation, he had let the case expire before the final decree was entered. Rebecca had assumed, the way most people would, that no news meant the divorce was done. She had moved states, remarried 8 years later, and had 2 children of her own. She had only discovered the problem because she was trying to sell a house that still listed her maiden name on some old title work. And a diligent title officer had pulled the original divorce file and noticed it had never been closed. Which meant that when Marcus married Chelsea 12 years ago, in a venue my parents had proudly paid half for, he had almost certainly committed bigamy. And every financial decision, every joint account, every tax filing, every custody-relevant document he and Chelsea had ever signed was resting on a legal foundation that wasn't there. My nephew's parents weren't actually married. They were about to fight over assets and custody in a divorce that, in the strictest legal sense, may not have been a divorce at all. Because one of the 2 marriages underneath it had never ended. And the other may never have begun. I sat with that for a long time. Then I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Rebecca, thanking her for trusting me and telling her I would help her find the right specialist to guide her through what she needed to do for her own protection. The second was to Andrea Park, the court advocate, to tell her there was a document trail she would want to be aware of. Though I would not be the one to introduce it. That was not my role. My only role was Eli. 3 days later, Chelsea showed up at my front door. She didn't text. She didn't call. She rang my doorbell at 8 in the morning with her hair still damp and her eyes already rimmed red. I opened the door because I believed, perhaps stupidly, that she deserved one human conversation before everything she thought she knew came apart. She did not apologize for the group chat. She started with an accusation. How could you go behind our backs to the court? How could you do this to Eli? I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me because I did not want her inside my house. I said, Chelsea, I am the trustee of Eli's education account. The court asked me questions. I answered them. Everything I told them is sitting in documents with my signature on them. If those answers hurt Marcus, that is not a thing I did to him. That is a thing he did to himself. Slowly, over 3 years, she started to cry then. Not the performative kind, but the real kind. The kind that comes when a person finally realizes the ship they are on has already hit something. She said, I don't understand what you're talking about. I said, you will. And then I said the thing I had been turning over in my mouth since Rebecca's second email. I said, Chelsea, before you go much further with this divorce, please ask Marcus about the paperwork from his first marriage. She looked at me like I had spoken in a language she didn't know. She said, His what I said. Ask him. Then I went inside and closed the door, and did not open it again, even when she rang the bell 4 more times. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel clean. I felt the particular, heavy stillness that comes when you finally set down a weight you did not realize you had been carrying for half your life. I called my therapist, a woman named Dr. Naomi Ellsworth, whom I had been seeing on and off for 3 years. And I asked if she had any time that day. She did. I drove to her office at 2 in the afternoon. I told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the reasons I trust her. When I finished, she asked me one question that has not left my head since. She asked, "When did you first learn that the only way to be loved in your family was to be useful in ways they could never repay?" I did not answer right away. I thought about being 9 years old and translating my mother's medical paperwork because my mother refused to wear her reading glasses in public. I thought about being 14 and mediating between my parents during a separation that almost happened but was papered over with my help. I thought about being 19 and co-signing Marcus's first apartment lease because he had already ruined his credit and our parents wouldn't do it. I thought about being 26 and withdrawing from a promotion track at my first job because my mother had a scare and decided she needed me local. Indefinitely. I thought about being 33 and agreeing to be the trustee on Eli's account because my grandmother's hand was shaking in mine. And I said, out loud, to Dr. Ellsworth, I think I was born into the job, the divorce hearing. When it finally happened, I did not need me to attend. My affidavit was on file. My exhibits were on file. The court had everything it needed from me in writing. What I heard afterward, through Andrea Park, and through a cousin, on my father's side, who had never liked Marcus, and did not mind telling me what she had learned, was that the hearing did not go anything like the way Marcus had planned. His financial disclosures were challenged, and he could not explain the 3-year pattern of discrepancies in Eli's custodial account without admitting that he had been treating it as his own discretionary fund. The judge did not appreciate this. Chelsea's attorney, freshly informed by Chelsea herself of the question I had asked her on my porch, had quietly pulled the relevant records from Rebecca's jurisdiction and presented them at the appropriate moment. Marcus did not get the outcome he wanted, in any respect. He did not get the custody arrangement he had asked for. He did not get the property division he had been angling for. He did not, it turned out, even get a divorce. Because the court had to first determine whether there had been a valid marriage to dissolve. That question, I understand, is still being worked out by specialists who charge more per hour than I make in a day. Eli's custodial account was court-ordered to be restored to its proper balance, with my trusteeship reaffirmed under tighter oversight, which I accepted because my grandmother had asked me to, and because the boy deserved someone watching the money who wasn't also spending it, my parents. When they finally accepted that I was not going to beg for reinstatement into a family I had been told to stay away from, I tried 3 different approaches. First, my mother called to tell me that Marcus had lost weight, was not sleeping, and might be suicidal. A claim that conveniently appeared whenever I was about to make a decision she didn't like. I told her, gently, that if she truly believed that, she should call a crisis line. Not me. She hung up. Second, my father, who had spent most of my life avoiding difficult conversations by pretending not to hear them, sent me a long handwritten letter in which he said he had always thought I was the strong one and that strong people should be able to forgive. I wrote him back, also by hand, and told him that strength and endless forgiveness were not the same thing, and that I loved him. But I was not going to walk back into a house whose foundation had been partly built on the assumption that my labor was free. Third, my sister-in-law showed up again, this time at my office, which was a serious breach of every professional boundary I lived by. Security turned her away. She did not try again. 6 weeks after the hearing, I met Chelsea one more time at her request. This time, at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us lived in, which she correctly read as a signal that I was not letting her back into my life. She looked tired in a way I had not seen before. She told me that her attorney was advising her to pursue an annulment rather than a divorce, because the simplest legal path forward, given what had been uncovered, was to acknowledge that her marriage to Marcus had never been valid. She told me she was not sure what she was supposed to tell Eli about any of it. She told me that her own parents, who had never warmed to Marcus, were unexpectedly kind to her, and that this was almost worse than if they had been angry. She told me that she was sorry, actually sorry, for the group chat message, because she understood now that she had written it at Marcus's instruction, not her own instinct. I listened to all of it without saying very much. When she finished, she asked me the question, every toxic family dynamic hopes you will eventually answer the way they want. She asked, "Is there any way we can go back to how things were?" I looked at her across the little coffee shop table with its wobbly leg and its ring of old sugar. And I told her the truth I had been practicing since my session with Dr. Ellsworth. I said, "Chelsea, how things were is exactly what got us here. I am not interested in going back to a version of family where I am the quiet infrastructure and everyone else is the decorative facade. If you want a real relationship with me at some point in the future, it will have to be built on something none of us have ever practiced." She nodded slowly. She didn't argue. Whatever part of her had been hoping for, the easy answer seemed to let it go right there at the table. We did not hug. We did not promise anything. She paid for her own coffee. I paid for mine. And we walked out in different directions. Which felt, for the first time in years, like an honest arrangement. The final piece I want to tell you about is my nephew. Because he is the reason I made every hard choice in this story. And I want you to know he is okay. Through the new court-ordered arrangement, I see Eli on scheduled visits. In a supervised capacity, that suits me fine, because I am not trying to replace his parents. I am trying to be the aunt who was actually there. On one of those visits, he asked me if I was still mad at his dad. I told him, as honestly as an adult can tell, a 7-year-old, that I was not mad, that I was tired. And that grown-up tired sometimes looks like being far away for a while. He thought about that. Then he asked me if his college money was still okay. Somebody had told him, probably badly, and probably in anger, that Aunt Claire had locked it up. I told him his college money was safer than it had ever been, because we had built a better wall around it. He nodded the way kids do when they accept something they don't fully understand, but trust anyway. And then he asked if we could make cookies. We made cookies. That is the part of the story my mother will never tell at Thanksgiving, because it does not fit the narrative she prefers, in which I am cold and punishing and hard to love. In the real version, the one nobody in my family will frame for the hallway, I am the person who made sure a boy who shares my last name still has a future that cannot be borrowed against by anyone, including his own father. Let me ask you something before I close this out. When a family calls you strong so that they can quietly hand you their weight, and then calls you cruel the moment you finally set it down, which label do you choose to keep? I have stopped collecting either. I answer to my own name, now. On my own accounts. With my own signature. And with the full knowledge that I am not the villain of the story my brother is telling himself. No matter how loudly he tells it. Sometimes, the deepest form of self-respect is refusing to rescue people from the consequences they worked very hard to earn. Even when those people share your last name, your childhood, or your holidays. So, tell me honestly, if your family told you to stay away, and then panicked the moment their arrangements stopped running on your invisible labor, would you have unlocked the door? Or would you have let them finish moving forward without you? All the way into the wall they built.